All right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you got some good gratitudes. If you want to throw in either a gratitude or a victory in the chat box just to share with everyone what you've got, I think would be awesome. So as we get going here, here's what I want to do is I want to talk with you today about the listing presentation, but I want to do it in a little bit different way than what we typically will go through and talk about it. And so what I really want to share with you this morning is a term called crystallization. Now, you may or may not have heard this term before, this term crystallization. Now, meaning I'm sure you've heard it, the word crystallization, but probably not so much in terms of real estate and as you are working with clients. And specifically, what I want to talk about in terms of crystallization is in terms of an appointment that you would be having with either a buyer or with a seller, and how this term crystallization is going to help you in terms of securing more listings or more buyer broker agreements signed. Now, where this came from was a guy that was a psychiatrist. And you'll have to forgive me, I can't remember the name of the guy off the top of my head right now. I had it a minute ago, but I can't remember now. But he actually wrote a book this book that he wrote was about, and if I remember right, I'm gonna have to look this up for you guys later, but if I remember right, I can't remember if there was a chapter that was called Transformations or if it was the book that was called Transformations. But that doesn't matter, not worth going and getting the book and reading, because I'm gonna share with you the important piece of it anyway right now. But here's what happened, is this guy he grew up in the Midwest, went out to California to do his doctorate, to become a doctor, and in the process of doing that, gets a job once he finishes medical school, gets a job, and now is going to be practicing psychiatry in California. Well, he goes and buys a house, and in the process of going and buying a house, he has this experience that he couldn't figure out. He didn't understand what was going on with him. And as a result of it, that was kind of the premise for him writing this book. Now, here's the interesting thing. This guy is studying to be a psychiatrist, goes and buys a house and has the experience of buying a home that creates in him this desire to go write a book because, like, I didn't understand how this all works. And he came up with this term called crystallization. So here's what I want to talk about with it, is whenever you are doing a presentation, whether it's to a buyer or even to a seller, what you are trying to create, to have happen within that client, is for them to crystallize. Now, I know some of you have been through a class that I teach, which is called needs analysis. And so if you like what I have to say, I'm going to be teaching that on the 28th of this month. So I guess maybe give a little bit of a commercial for the class. But so the 28th of this month, and I believe the 30th is going to be the second day of that class. So it's a 2-day class from 9 o'clock California time, 10 o'clock Utah time, until about noon. So it's 2 hours on the 28th and the 30th of this month. But so I can give you a little bit more detail because I'll spend 4 hours explaining it versus, another about 15 minutes or so. Now, but here's what happened, is he goes out and has this experience, writes a book about it. And so what we are trying to do whenever we are going on a listing appointment or working with a buyer is you have to create this thing which we call crystallization. What happens is this, is until someone crystallizes, they are not going to make a decision. Now, and that goes for any purchase that we have. And that's what this guy figured out, is that until crystallization occurs, we will have this back and forth thing. So when you have a client, whether it's a buyer of a home or the seller of a home, but let me talk about for the buyer, because you usually see this show up a little more with a buyer than the seller, but it does happen with the seller as well. When you have a buyer who wants to keep looking at more houses, more houses, more houses, more houses, we're not sure, we're not sure, we're not sure, what they are telling you is that they have not crystallized. So I want to explain to you what crystallization is and then give you just a little bit of a brief explanation of how you create it. Because what has to happen is one of two things. See, if you understand how to create crystallization, you can go and have this take place within your client and you can help the process happen. If you don't understand it, and so again, let me just stick on working with a buyer. When you've got a buyer of a home who's going out and consistently saying, I'm not sure, I need to see more houses, I need to see more houses, that is their subtle way of telling you they have not crystallized. Same thing with a seller on a listing. If at the end of your presentation, they are not prepared and ready to make a decision, the reason they're not is because they have not crystallized. And so the way that people will proceed to make a decision is going to be through one of two ways. The first way, if somebody has not been trained in this, the first way that people will end up making a decision is through a term that's called information loading. When you are watching sports, if they ever come back again, although the good news is I think we're getting both basketball and baseball at the end of this month, so I'm really excited. But if you watch a game, what ends up happening is during the commercials, you are seeing commercials, and the idea of those commercials is to information load you. See, what happens is they load you with information so that when you go to the store and you say, oh, I need to get some chips, the first chip that will come to your mind, hopefully, is the one that they have information loaded you with. So with your clients, that's what is happening. A buyer who is not willing to make a decision on buying a home, or a seller who says, I got to interview more people before I make a decision, the reason they feel like they need to see more houses, or the reason a seller needs to interview more people, is they are trying to information load this into their brain so that they can make a good decision. See, another way of thinking of it is when we make a list of all the pros and cons, in essence, what we are doing by making a list of pros and cons is creating crystallization within ourselves, is by thinking that through. So your job really is either to let people go information load, which takes a long, long time for them to then make a decision, or you can take them through this process where you then create crystallization. Well, now let me show you what that looks like. So hopefully you can see on the board, but if not, I'll explain it just a little bit. But here's what happens is 10% of who you are as a personality is conscious, and 90% of who you are is unconscious. So I'm not sure how well you can see the board, but I've just got a box drawn here with a sliver up here of that's 10% and a bigger down here that's 90%. 10% of who you are is conscious. 90% is unconscious. Now, in this conscious part of your brain is where things are logical. This is where things are logical, they're reasonable, they're rational, and in the conscious part of the brain. But down here in the unconscious part of the brain is where the emotion exists. Well, now, you guys all know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but buying and selling a home is an emotional decision. So when you are going to, or when the clients are going to be buying or selling, it's really an emotional decision. But the problem is the way that we have been trained to communicate, the way all of us communicate is we have been trained to communicate at this level, the conscious level, which makes sense. And so what happens is something like this. So let me show you, I'm going to draw just a replication of that same box over here of 10% and 90%. So what happens is this. We go into a presentation and we start to talk. And what ends up typically happening is our conversation goes back and forth from this conscious level to their conscious level. So we bounce back and forth from the consciousness to the consciousness within each other. But the problem is they're making their decision down here based on an emotional level. So it's based on some emotions is why they're going to do it. Now, where we run into the problem is the way that we have all been trained to communicate. And hopefully you guys, like I love quizzing on this in my classes of your job is to be a leader. Your job is to lead people to make a decision. Now, the number one skill that the leader has to do that is through our communication. And so really what we're talking about today is just that communication and being a better communicator. So what happens is this though, when people are then communicating with you what they are wanting to take place, whether it's buy or sell, doesn't matter, they have these emotions down here that they're working with. And what happens is now they've got to take what is going on down here in the emotional part, the unconscious part of the brain, and they're putting it into this conscious level and then explaining it to you. You are interpreting it and then putting it down into your unconscious as well. Well, in order for them to make a decision, we have to be able to tap in down here to this emotional area. And the way that we have typically been trained to communicate is doesn't typically happen. And so what I want to share with you today is how do you create that? How do you make it happen? Well, so now let's talk about on a listing presentation for a minute. The buyer side of this is a lot easier. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of the listing side, But keep in mind that on the buyer side is even easier with this, but it's the same concept. Now, so if you think about our listing presentation, we go through a number of steps. So the first thing is that we want to tap, which is that thank, acknowledge, and promise. So we're going to thank, we acknowledge, we promise. Then the second thing that we are going to do is we're going to give them an overview of telling them, here's where we're going to go with this presentation. So as I give you my presentation, I'm going to tell you that first we're going to talk about your needs, wants, and expectations. Then we're going to talk about what separates me from everyone else. Then we'll talk about the price of your home and how we should price your home and what that should look like. And then after that, if you're comfortable and confident, then I'm going to ask you to sign some paperwork. So that's the first part. Once we've done that, now we're going to talk to them about their needs, wants, and their expectations. Okay? So if I'm going to talk to them about the needs, wants, and expectations, what typically we do is we now start to talk to them about needs, wants, and expectations at this level right here, is at the conscious level. Now, what goes on though is information is stored in your brain in these discrete locations. So let me draw this up here. So I'm giving you this of the brain again. Hopefully this one's a little better to see. But information is stored, the pictures in one area of your brain, the decisions in another area of your brain, and then the feelings in another area. Well, what happens is the people know what they're looking for. They know what they want. Our job then is to create this crystallization. Crystallization occurs when the pictures, the decisions, and the feelings all reintegrate and come back together again. So our job really is almost of like, think of it as the game of Jeopardy. All the answers are there in the person's brain. They're stored down here in the unconscious. Our job then is to go and ask questions of them in such a way that we create crystallization. Because once we create crystallization, they are now ready and empowered to make a decision. And that is when they are going to be ready to buy. Okay, so here's how we do it. Typically, what most agents will do is when we get to the questions section, we will now ask somebody, so share with me, what are you ultimately trying to accomplish? Which is great. That is a great, great question. Ultimately, what are you trying to accomplish in the sale of your home? But then typically, here's where we make the mistake. What usually happens at that point is then people will start to talk and they will explain, well, we decided we wanted to buy a bigger house. Well, the challenge of where we as agents get ourselves in trouble is we then quit at that with that question and move on to the next question, which does not create crystallization. See, the way that we typically communicate actually blocks crystallization from occurring. And in order for us to get the crystallization to take place, what we have to do is ask additional questions. So I like to call these prompters. So prompters are prompting people to continue to talk. So if I said to somebody, hey, so ultimately, what are you trying to accomplish? And they said to me, well, we wanted to buy a bigger house. Before I move on to the next question, I want to stay with a prompter. And on a prompter, what I want to say is, hey, that's great. Share with me a little bit more about that, or say more about that. You want to use things like that. And once you have asked a question, then you want to say either tell me more, keep going, or wow, that's interesting, what else? So you want to make sure that you are repeating and affirming back to them, hey, you want to buy a bigger house? That's great. Tell me more about that. What happens as soon as you say, tell me more about that, or share with me a little bit more about that, what it does is now it forces them to, instead of communicating with us at this logic level, where at the conscious level, it now forces them to get down into the emotional part of things. It forces them to dig deeper down into there of what really is behind this decision that they are going to make, which is going to lead them towards buying or selling a home. So with a buyer of a home, I always in a buyer interview want to start the question with, describe for me your ideal home. And then once they describe it, I'm going to say, that's great. Tell me more, or keep going, or what else can you tell me about that? The more that you can just keep saying to them, hey, that's great. Tell me more about that. What else? Keep going, say more, forces them down into where the emotion is. Now, if you remember, part of what we are trying to accomplish in order to get someone to choose us is we've got to get to them, we've got to build a connection and have some rapport with them. The way that you get that connection and rapport with them is through exactly this. When you say, tell me more about that, and they start to describe it in more detail, what ends up happening is it forces them actually then into this emotional part of things, but it also creates this connection between you and them, where what happens is they start to feel like you really, really understand what is important to them. Now, the cool thing about this is you will notice it is really not that difficult. All it is a matter of doing is just saying, share with me more about that. Keep going. Tell me more about that. And what I like to do is to keep asking that, hey, what else? Keep going, or tell me more about that, until they will say something like, well, I don't know what else to tell you. Once they say that, you know you have exhausted it, and it's now time to move to the next question that you want to ask, and then do the same concept with that. Now, let me give you a brief example of this that I taught an agent on with this. So this goes back about 4 or 5 years ago. I had an agent that came through that needs analysis class that I was talking to you that I'm going to teach at the end of the month. As he came through the class and I taught this, he came and said, hey, I've got an opportunity to go out and meet with a for sale by owner. Can I practice it with you? I said, yes. We sat down, we ran through and did a practice on this. At the end of the practice, what ended up happening is he left and went out on this listing presentation. Now, keep in mind, it's his very first one he's ever gone on. He goes out on it and he does exactly what I'm talking about. Just says, hey, share with me ultimately what you were wanting to accomplish. Wow, tell me more about that. That's really interesting. Wow, tell me more. Keep going. And then goes through all the questions and does all of that. Gets done with his presentation, asks them to sign. They go ahead and sign. So he gets the listing. At the end of the presentation, they say to him, how long have you been doing this? Now, this is an agent who is younger, so early 20s. And they said, how long have you been doing this? And the agent said, you know, believe it or not, this is the first listing, or you're the first client I've ever gone and met with. And because he thought they caught me, I did such a bad job. In reality, what they said is, wow, like, I don't believe that that's true, because you did such a good job. So really, how long have you been doing it? And he said, no, really, this is my first one. And they were like, okay, whatever. Like, clearly we can see you've done this for a while, even though he was young. See, it creates in you to be the expert, because what happens is you create that connection where they feel like you really understand what is important to them. Now, I want to just share with you one other example of this. And this one actually goes back to an agent in California that was trained in this a number of years ago. They went out and had the opportunity to go out on, at that time, and this is probably 15 years ago, they had the opportunity to go out on a $15 million listing. So today that listing's probably worth 40 or 50, I don't know. But they go out on this listing and they sat down with the seller and they did exactly this concept of what we're talking about, is saying, hey, share with me ultimately what you're trying to accomplish. She shared what she was trying to accomplish. Then the other question that I would recommend with a seller that you always ask, but this should probably be one of your last questions that you ask them, is share with me what your biggest concern is, or what your biggest fear is. So this agent goes out on this $15 million listing. The scenario was, it was an older lady, her husband had passed away, and she just decided the house was too much, too big, she wanted to downsize. So the agent says, share with me what your biggest concerns are in getting this home sold. Well, she just said, well, I'm just a little worried of if it will sell, or and how many people are going to come through the home. Well, so he dug deeper. Hey, tell me more about that. And here's what she said. I've interviewed a few other agents about helping to sell my home, and every one of them told me they were going to put it on their office tour. They were going to put it on their board tour. They were going to get all of these people coming through the house. And she said, my biggest concern is that white carpet that's in the living room was a birthday present from my husband. He had it handmade in Peru, or, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly right, but $150,000 spent on this carpet that was white. And she said, my concern is I picture that carpet being destroyed before I even have moved out of the home. Well, the agent said, well, hey, let's do this then. I'm not going to do any board tours. I'm not going to bring it on an office tour. I'm going to only show the home to people who are pre-approved. And I'm going to go down and buy some booties, which I guess is a common thing. I guess now that COVID, everybody's getting booties, right? But back then he said, I'm going to go buy a box of booties, and anybody that comes through the house, we're going to make them wear the booties. Now, guess who got the listing? That agent. And the reason was because they asked questions in such a way, they created the crystallization. They got down into the emotion. They got to what was the emotional thing behind her selling her home. And when you get to that, it creates a connection between you and them in such a way that what happens is you're it. They don't really want to talk to anybody else because you understand them. You understand what is important to them. And as a result of that, you end up getting the listing. And then the same thing as I was saying on the buyer side, if you will continue to ask the questions and create that crystallization, they don't need to go see a ton of houses. They now understand what they're looking for, which is typically not a big kitchen. There is some benefit behind it. So that's probably where I would sum this up with for you guys, is think of it this way, is there are features. So features and benefits. They talk to us in terms of features because that's where this logic is in the consciousness, is the features. But what they end up buying, or if there's a seller, the way they end up choosing you as their agent is based on the benefits, which the benefits sit down here in the emotional level. See, really what I'm telling you is your job is to go and connect features to the benefits. And when you do that, it creates the crystallization, which think of crystallization as every time you have an aha moment, crystallization is occurring. But not every time that you crystallize will it be an aha moment, meaning it doesn't have to always be this aha when somebody crystallizes, but every time you've ever had an aha moment, crystallization is occurring. So here's my challenge for you today. What I want you guys to do, and maybe even work on this a little bit as you're prospecting today, but your next appointment that you go on, challenge yourself to ask a few additional questions of asking them, hey, share a little bit more with me about that. See, the more you can have them sharing, the more they're talking, they enjoy hearing themselves talk, which creates the connection, which is what we need in order for them to then crystallize and make the decision to feel comfortable and confident with us. So my challenge for you today is, as you're prospecting or any appointments that you go on, to do that. And then I would love to hear back from you as to what difference it made in your presentations. And I promise you, if you will go and do more of that, you're going to see more success in your business. So hopefully that was helpful for you today. I appreciate you being on with me and taking the time out of your day to listen to what I have to say, and hopefully it was helpful. So anyway, let's close it up now with some closing affirmations and then go out there and make it an awesome